Hello, freaks, geeks, and scrufftards. Welcome to the war zone. I'm Scruffy, and this is Skruffytalez. So we're gonna take a look at various locations along the front line. We're gonna take a look at Sumy Oblast, where Ukraine has gained the upper hand and forcing the Russians back. We're also gonna take a look at a Russian assault at Vovchansk that apparently failed. And but we're also going to highlight how Russian maps and Russian content creators, or rather pro-Russian content creators covering the war, are lying to you because the maps they're using are bullshit. And we're going to show this with a map that highlights Russian airstrikes provided by Clement Moulin. And so you can quite clearly see where the Russians are striking the Ukrainians, and that tells us where the Russians are at, right? So we're gonna, and then we're gonna take a look at the situation at Pokrovsk because it is confusing as hell. Different mappers are showing us different things, and it's just pure chaos. Russians are pushing to relieve their troops in the pockets. Ukrainians are pushing in to tighten the noose around the pockets. There's artillery strikes and airstrikes all over the place, and no one really knows what the hell is going on. As far as us armchair generals and people visiting YouTube know, right? The Ukrainians and the Russian generals, and they probably have a better grasp on the situation. But people who use open source intelligence maps, it's confusing as hell, as you will notice. Anyway, let's get this show on the road. Right, so before jumping over to the maps, we got this map of airstrikes made by Clement Moulin. We've been using them before to check out Russian airstrikes in and around Pokrovsk to highlight where the Russians are at and stuff like that. But I saw that he had updated this map on Ukraine Matters video, so credit where credit's due. And I just remembered, we got this guy. Why haven't I used him more often? So it's an interesting map, as Ukraine Matters points out. So you can see here, the interesting part is the yellow and the white lines, or the dots. These are the airstrikes conducted by Russia in August through October. And as you can see, yellow and white uh, overlap, right? So that kind of tells us that the Russian lines has not moved at all, basically, throughout these 4 months, August, September, or 3 months, August, September, and October. And it's very interesting when we take a look at the breakthrough. Now, the Russians, they claim they're up here. We have actually seen evidence now that they've pushed further north, but, you know, the official Russian map is that Russia has control over this entire area here. But take a look. Why do we have a bunch of airstrikes in July, August, September, and October in the middle of the area where the Russians are supposed to be in control? Interesting. And you can also see that, you know, the airstrikes perfectly follow the pocket here, and you can see here that you do have a lot of white and yellow in between all over the place in what the Russians claim to be a one singular cohesive front line. Why are they bombarding their own troops? Is there a reason for this, or is it because you have Ukrainians in between all over the place? Right, so cutting the Russians up. This part here is, quite frankly, a very confusing part of the front line, where front lines intermix and stuff like that. So I'll show you in a moment here. But it's interesting to take note. Take a look. I mean, you can follow the airstrikes here around Shakove, for instance, and the east of Shakove, as the Russians are trying to push up. It's slow going. Same thing down here at Rodinske, where they've been hammering the hell out of the Ukrainians without much to show for it. And you can see this is interesting here, west of Pokrovsk. This is really interesting that all of a sudden we see an uptick in airstrikes here after they have secured Kotlyne and Udachne. So is this evidence that they intend to push up, because these airstrikes lead all the way up to this vital supply line that's flowing that comes in here into Pokrovsk. So I'm wondering if the Russians are preparing for a push out of Kotlin North straight for this supply line. Something we've been talking about for a long time. But interesting, isn't it? You clearly see how the Russian advance has stagnated, and all of a sudden all the airstrikes overlap, and we have airstrikes, recent airstrikes, in the middle of territory that the Russians claim that they are in control of. Weird, huh? Anyway, moving on. We're using IceW's map here now because they have some interesting updates zooming in here on the Sumy Oblast. We can see here that the Ukrainians are pushing into Yunakivka, and they made a push straight into the center of town apparently. We know that they've been pushing out to the lakes here and that they're threatening Oleksivka from the west according to other mappers. But IceW claims that they have geolocated evidence, otherwise they wouldn't be marking it as blue as they are doing here, that the Ukrainians have pushed into the center of Yunakivka. Really interesting. We got some updates from Vovchansk. We know that the Russians have begun a push along the railway here, the roads here, coming down from a factory. But the Ukrainians have something to say about it. Let's take a look at that real quick. So I'm using some lines here from Swedish author Lars Wildereng and his website cornucopia.se. If anyone's from Scandinavia, you can head on over there to take a look at what he has to say about things. But he talks about this big Russian assault at Vovchansk, and the Russians used a lot of armor and armored vehicles to try and commit to this assault. And as we have here reported by the Ukrainians, over the past few days we've seen the enemy trying to become more active on the Vovchansk direction. Yesterday they even carried out a massive assault against one of the border guard unit's defensive lines. This equipment was destroyed, and having failed to achieve any success, the enemy retreated. And he says, Lars Wildereng says that this is reflected in the Russian casualties that were 1,090 troops, 63 transports, 14 IFVs or APCs, 5 tanks, and 18 howitzers, and also 1 heavy air-to-air defense system. And it's the armored losses that stands out in the Russian casualty figures, reflecting that they committed to this assault at Vovchansk and it failed, and therefore we have 14 IFVs and APCs destroyed along with 5 tanks because the Russians tried this big mechanized assault up around Vovchansk. So the Russians tried to come down through here, is my guess. We've seen evidence on the other mappers that this is where Russia committed to an attack, and apparently the Ukrainians put a stop to it quite effectively. We also have Russians coming out here. We've seen on other mappers that Russia is pushing in this area along the border region, and here we have on the ISW map that they are indeed pushing for Odradne. And we also have here east of Kupiansk, another push by the Russians. So Russia is trying it appears to be trying big push here, and they are pushing on Kupiansk to secure this corner of Ukraine, this corner of the battlefield. We'll see how that goes, but it seems as if this is where they have aimed some focus of late, right, with the pushes here, coming down hard on Kupiansk, and now also trying a big mechanized assault at Vovchansk. Not much else going on except for, and we have some interesting updates here at Pokrovsk. Take a look at this. This is what ISW is saying. This is their map. They're saying that Russia is in control of Novoekonomichne, that they've pushed out into Krasny Liman and into Rodinske, that they've pushed out to Drozhny. We've seen this on other mappers. pushing back into Pankivka, close to this bridge at Pankivka. And here in the north, we can see here, this is Kucherev Yar. We can see here, according to ISW, Russia is pushing back into Zoloty Kolodiaj. And at the same time, Ukraine is pushing down here into Vilna. So that is ISW. So according to ISW, Russia has gained some momentum north of Pokrovsk, meanwhile, and also in this corner up here. But here, where the Russians have removed a lot of troops out of the Sumy region, Ukraine keeps pushing the Russians back. And most recently, they're back into Yunakivka. And if we take a look at Mayakovsk 73's map, we can get some confirmation. You can see here in the center of Yunakivka, Russians taking POW, and you have Russian drone strikes against their own troops that are surrendering. So Russian troops surrender, and the Russians call in drone strikes on those surrendering troops in the center of Yunakivka. So confirmation that the Ukrainians are pushing into Yunakivka. And here we have, airstrikes and drone strikes at the Russians as they're trying to come through here at Vovchansk. Apparently, it was a huge disaster for the Russians in that attempt. But here we have confirmation that the Russians are in Udradne, expanding in the control here in this corner up here and the northeastern corner of Ukraine. And what else? The Russians are advancing here. We can see it south of Siversk. We have some Ukrainian counterattacks in and around this area here, along the front line here, where the Russians are trying to bypass the Surovikin line, the Syrska line in the south. And of course, Pokrovsk. Here we have a lot of Russian airstrikes in territory that the Russians claim to be in control of. The Russians claim they're in control of this area here. For some reason, they're shelling it like crazy. Same thing over here, where they claim they're in control. We have airstrikes in the northern part of town. We saw that on that first map. What else we can see here? It's yellow, but ISW says it's confirmed that we have Russians in the southern part of Novoekonomichne, and that it's confirmed that they are operating down here. We can see here Russians pushing out into Dorozhny, but we have Ukrainians counterattacking. This is Russian artillery. It's a couple of days old now, so but you can clearly see here that you have some confirmation of what the what ISW is saying. But this is where it gets interesting, because here you have, yes, this is Ukrainians blowing up a building, so the Russians have a presence. That is what we're seeing. Take a look at this. This is a Russian vehicle destroyed. So we have Russians up here in Pankivka, and this is the bridge, like ISW said. But was it a push that allowed them to take control of Pankivka? Who knows? No confirmation on this map that they pushed into Zoloty Kolodiaj again, but ISW is a reliable source. It's not unthinkable that the other mappers will adjust over time here in a couple of days. But I mean, you can see ISW has all of this as Russian. Deep State says this part here is completely in the gray zone. So does Andrew. Andrew has this entire area as a gray zone. And you can see here that Mayakovsk 73 has all of this as contested as well. So it's a very confusing battlefield, and we are not really sure of what's going on here, to be perfectly honest. But what we do know is that the Russians are conducting airstrikes all over the place, like we saw initially, indicating that we have Ukrainians in between these certain pockets of Russian control, right? So why don't we check my map? We're starting off with Sumy Oblast, where we have the Ukrainians have pushed up here. They haven't really pushed up into this part here. It's just that this was one, all of this was one, what do you call it? section, and I just highlighted it as Ukrainian. This part here is more than likely still Russian, but the Ukrainians have taken the lake and essentially pushed the Russians back to the border here in Sumy Oblast, and then you have Ukraine trying to push into Oleksivka. We've seen attempts coming in across these fields that have failed, but the Russians are feeling pressure to the north of Oleksivka as well. And most recently, Yunakivka. The Russians had pushed in and taken the entirety of the town, or basically except for this southern part here. And now Ukraine has come up here on the east and managed to push all the way in to the center of town here, right next to the river, where we saw Russians surrendering, and we saw the Russians committing drone strikes against their own troops as they were surrendering. And we know Russia has moved troops out of the Sumy area, and this might be an indication that is now having an effect, that the Russians don't have enough troops to hold back the Ukrainians as the Ukrainians are pushing back into Yunakivka. And my map for the Pokrovsk area, if we go down here, this is where we saw that the Russians have begun a lot of airstrikes in the last month or two, indicating that they might try to push out of Kotlin. It's not that far, it's only a mile or 2 miles or whatever it could be from the Russian positions down here up to the E50 highway. And if they reach this far, then they essentially cut the supplies into Pokrovsk. Ukraine can still move in supplies through Ryshny here and follow this country road here, and then come down into Pokrovsk from the north and probably use some country roads and dirt roads up here as well. But if Russia can reach the E50, they are in a really good position to cut a lot of supply lines. Ukraine can move through Ryshny through here, along this highway here as well. But as you can imagine, if the Russians can begin operating here, then these two supply lines are cut. Then the Ukrainians must move through here instead. And then Ukraine don't have all that many options left if we reach that point. So a lot of airstrikes here of late, indicating, I think that is an indication that Russia will begin on pushing operations to push north towards the E50. In Pokrovsk itself, these are the high-rise buildings that are being shelled by the Russians, but Russian maps, and if you go to pro-Russian content creators, you will see that they have these buildings under Russian control, which is strange since the Russians are shelling them with their own artillery. Yeah. Now, if you take a look at the ISW map, this is claimed Russian control, so you have some claimed Russian control here and here as well. Russian mappers are showing that the Russians have pushed up here. If this is true, if the Russians are up here, then they have essentially cut all supplies into Pokrovsk. You can see here how the E50 and the Ryshny roads, they come in and link up here in this network here, this hub. So if the Russians are here, they have more or less cut these supply lines into Pokrovsk, which we would have heard about if that was the case. But the Russians are just bullshitting as always. That we have had Russian infiltrated units ambushing sporadic Ukrainians in Pokrovsk up here, and that is why they show on their maps that they are in control of this area. But it's more than likely 2 to 3 guys, maybe 6 or 8, that are running around, sneaking around and ambushing Ukrainians. It's not like you have a Russian battalion in control of this part of town. In reality, the Russians are stuck down here outside of the high-rise buildings, because high-rise buildings are a bitch to assault. You need hundreds of troops for each building to clear out corridors, hallways, rooms, basements, cellars, attics, what have you. No, they're not gonna steamroll through this part of town. This is a bitch. This is gonna take time, like you wouldn't believe. It demands so much resources pushing through a single building, a high-rise building, and you have dozens of them. You're gonna need hundreds of troops per building. Each soldier is gonna need thousands of bullets and hundreds of hand grenades, and I don't know how many liters of water to be able to effectively push through one of these buildings. So you can imagine the amount of resources and manpower required per building slows down the process in itself. Never mind that these buildings favor the defender to an extreme extent. You basically need 10 or 20-1 advantage as the attacker, a 10 or 20-1 advantage as the attacker trying to push into these buildings. So no, the Russians are not in control yet of this part of town, as evident by their artillery strikes. And same thing here. Claims are that the Russians said this part here is more than likely heavily contested. Absolutely. But we do have Ukrainians down here. Russian air artillery strikes are aimed at this part of town. But I'm fairly certain that this is a mixed bag. You have some buildings occupied by Russians, other buildings occupied by Ukrainians. It's all intermixed. There is no confirmed perfect front line in this part of town, would be my guess. I think, this street might be Ukrainian, this street might be Russian, that building might be Ukrainian, and that building might be Russian, and, it's just a mess, basically. And then you have drones hunting everything that tries to move in the area. So that is I think that's a realistic assessment of the situation here in Pokrovsk, that the Russians are struggling pushing into these high-rise buildings. And this part of town here, I mean, they're funneled. You can't operate out here. You can't operate here. Wide open territory. You get funneled into this suburban area, and it is more than likely chaotic, and you don't really know where you have friendlies and where there is no front line. This is just a no man's land, and where everything is intermingled, Russian and Ukrainian units. Chaotic, to say the least. So that's Pokrovsk. The Russians are, of course, bombarding up here with airstrikes, as we've seen. And then they are striking the rest of town down here with artillery, as we've also seen. Moving over to Novoekonomichne, I think this is a fair estimation as well. ISW says that Russia is in control of southern part of town. That is concerning. The question is if the Russians are in control of the territory outside of town. We saw them a week or two ago trying to make moves north here. Ukraine responded with drones. So the question is if the Russians establish a presence or if the Ukrainians manage to wipe them out or not. But ISW seems to be fairly certain that Russia is back in control of the southern part of Novoekonomichne, maybe even the entirety of the town, which would be troublesome. If that is the case, maybe I should highlight this as unknown, to be perfectly honest, because if that is the case, then the Russians can move units and troops and resupplies, or supplies rather, north through Novoekonomichne into the Rudinsky pocket and support it and reinforce it and resupply it. In that case, the pocket has been broken up, and the Russians have managed a breakthrough and are now supporting the Rudinsky troops, the Rudinsky pocket. Likewise, moving north, it's confusing here as well. All mappers seem to agree that Boykivka is contested now. Some mappers have it under Russian control. Other mappers have it as in the gray zone being contested. Most mappers agree that Novotrotsky is back in Russian control. You remember Ukraine came down this way along the road and came in here, threatening Boykivka and the bridge from the east. Now it seems as if Russia is back in control of Novotrotsky, as well as Boykivka being contested. At the same time, we've seen Russians push north into Pankivka, and we've seen Russian vehicles being destroyed up here. Does that mean they're in control of Pankivka, or was it just a Hail Mary Leroy Jenkins move by a single vehicle? I'm not sure. But we're seeing indications that the Russians are expanding and gaining control back over territory here in Novotrotsky, maybe even Boykivka, and pushing north into Pankivka. At the same time, Most mappers seem to agree that this part here is in the gray zone, contested, maybe even under Ukrainian control. This is a big hill just outside of the town of Mayak. On top of that hill, you can see you have fortifications. Unknown who is in control of these, but they are in the gray zone according to most mappers. The valley over here appears to be in the gray zone, as does this part here, some windbreaks to the northern part of this big hill. Yeah, the southern end here is a valley with lakes in it. But we are seeing Russians coming out this way into Drozhny and into Ivanivka. Maybe an indication that Russia is not in control of the hill and they're trying to come down to the west of it and break through to reach the Rodinsky pocket down here to relieve their troops here in the Shakova pocket. I mean, you can see there are multiple mappers. Everyone has their own interpretation, and trying to combine it is a bitch, to be honest. So, I mean, different mappers claim different things, and it tells us just how messy this part of the battlefield is. It's really difficult getting a fix on what is happening. It's like Andrew Perpetua, he's just given up. He's just, all of this is contested. I don't care where someone might or might not be. All of this is contested area, which is a fair assessment. Moving north, we've seen on the ISW map that Russia has pushed into Soloti Kolodiash. No one else is showing that as of yet, so we'll see if that gets confirmed or not. But according to ISW, Russia has moved up from these, you have some woods here with some trenches and what have you that the Russians are holding. So they've moved up into this valley and pushed north into the southern parts of Solotnikov. Southern parts are in the center of it, but gain access to these buildings here and some vegetation along the river, and managed to move more than likely along this windbreak here into the center of town and taken these buildings, according to ISW. So yeah, that's pretty much the situation at Pokrovsk and up in Sumy and elsewhere. Confusing, but I mean, the Russians are pushing strongly. They're trying to relieve these three pockets: Kucherov, Shakova, and Rodinsky. We've been talking about the Russians trying to come through Novoekonomichny here in the south to punch through to reach the Rodinsky pocket. Ukraine has been trying to push into Boykivka. We've seen that on multiple mappers, but it seems now that the Russians have countered and are pushing back. They might be in Boykivka, and they might actually be pushing up through Pankivka here as well. So a lot of stuff happening here, back and forth, very dynamic, and it's difficult to gauge where the actual front lines are located. Nothing strange. War is chaos and confusing, so armchair generals shouldn't be able to figure out what the situation is, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, so yeah, that's gonna have to be it. So the main key takeaway, I guess, is that the Russians are lying about their maps and how far they have progressed, how far they have advanced. I mean, looking at the airstrikes and the artillery strikes, we clearly learn where the Ukrainians have troops. In that northern push, there are airstrikes and artillery strikes right smack in the middle where the Russians claim they're in control. Clearly, you have Ukrainians in between the Russian units, cutting them off, forming these distinct pockets. And in Rodinsky, the Russians are shelling with artillery locations that they claim they have under control. So it's just bullshit. The Russian map more than likely just includes everything from controlled territory to contested territory to infiltrated territory. So if they have 2 or 3 guys pushing through Ukrainian lines, setting up shop within Ukrainian territory, and then with a radio call in drone strikes and artillery strikes, the Russians claim, oh, we have troops on site, they're guiding in airstrike, that means we are in control of that territory. I mean, that's not how it works. Every army in the world uses infiltration units to call in airstrikes deep behind enemy lines, but you're not in control of that territory because of that, right? We can all agree on that. So the Russian maps are misleading for propaganda purposes to show the Vatnik crowd a false narrative, right? So all the Vatniks that are listening, and if you're still with me this far, your trusted sources are lying to you. The airstrike, the Russian airstrikes and the Russian artillery strikes is evidence of that. I don't know what else to tell you. But yeah, the second key, there are like a number of key takeaways, I guess. So yeah, the Russians are lying about this. Is a rant as always, but you know, yeah, Ukraine is gaining momentum more and more in Sumy, unsurprisingly. And north of Pokrovsk, it is chaotic. Russians are pushing, Ukrainians are pushing. You have airstrikes and artillery strikes all over the place, and it's difficult to figure out exactly what the hell is going on. So, end of this rant, and as always, go på marsch Ukraine and give them hell.